Yeah, so what we had just discussed, welcome to Friday, November 15th Coffee Talk. And want to thank Brian and Riley for joining us from Viking. And we're going to be talking about some things related to some new labeling issues, but that are coming about, or requirements or what have you, notifications. But prior to that, we were just having a brief chat about the recent market outlook on some things, given some of the feedback that buyers are doing, and there's a bit of a that's the right one, and a little bit of an uptick on ocean freight getting booked up and stuff like that. So ahead of us getting into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, I just wanted to have a touch on a couple of things. One, I did set a notification out to all of our ag reps relating to how the Port of Vancouver strike has impacted pending immediate deliveries from offshore. And so my understanding, and I believe, Riley, we're going to get a briefing to get shot out. But as it stands at the moment, we've kind of pushed what we thought would maybe be NOV or front-ended DEIS is going to be kicked out a month to 6 weeks or so. But what my ask is going to be then is from you for anything that we have booked for and paid for coming, is just to provide guidance as you receive updates on when the vessel's going to get loaded, and then we can follow that all the way through and just see how the system actually works. And so, because some of the folks maybe haven't got experience with how this, they go to the shed and buy it and all that, but because we're dealing directly from the manufacturing level with you, we have a different perspective that I'd like to be able to share with our folks on how things work. And we had a little hiccup. It's only winter, so nothing but a little bit of time to go by. It's not impacting anything, but it's just a good case study for us to get educated a little bit. So I'll leave you with that. And then the second thing was the tariff thing. Right now, the world is figuring out what's going to happen with the tariffs. We don't know for sure. Like Trump has said 60% tariff on the Chinese stuff is going to happen. They're still sorting out if it's on 100% of all goods, or if it's every ingredient, or if it's on finished goods only. The timeline that's going to happen, there's going to be some cat and mouse back and forth. You guys charge us 60% of this. Well, we're going to knock a couple million tons of soybean imports out of you, like they always do, that kind of stuff. So the point being is this is right now a real gray area. So between it and currency fluctuation, the Canadian dollar took it on the chin big time. So that's impact some valuations. And then what normally will happen on things like this is there'll be a rush for ocean freight because those that happen to have goods sitting on dock or pending sales in the US, they're going to scoop up every little bit of vessel room to get that stuff over here, just to avoid having to deal with what may or may not happen, because again, it's that gray area. So you can expect probably immediate ocean freight will probably pop up a bit, and then it'll figure out its own cadence with a little bit of time. But just wanted to touch on those two things briefly. I think that's what I had. We had talked about the different surfactants used in glyphosate and that, but just let me know if you want any information about that. But other than that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And thanks for your patience, Brian, as I just wanted to get a couple of things out of the way right off the hop. And want to thank you once again for lending your knowledge and your understanding of the current status of where things are at relating to product mixing and labels and how things might be changing for this coming year. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you and look forward to your take on stuff.
Sure. So I trust everybody can see my screen.
You look good.
Okay. Very timely discussion, because in fact, this past week, there have been a lot of discussions about the new PMRA tank mix guidelines internally. So I'm going to talk about the current situation first, how we got here, and then I'm going to finish off with what the new guidelines are, and specifically what Viking is doing in regard to those new guidelines. It's not as a dramatic change as you think, but it's really putting the onus on the companies to decide how they want to manage tank mixing with their products. So starting off with, what is the PMRA and what do they do? Because when it comes to regulatory, tank mixes, new product registrations, it always comes back to the PMRA. PMRA is short for Pest Management Regulatory Agency. So in Canada, they're the government agency that's responsible for pesticide regulation, which includes getting registrations, label changes, anything related to the product label itself. Getting registered belongs to the PMRA. They are regulated heavily in Canada, probably more so than the US, and they would say it's to ensure minimal risk to human health and environment. It's a balancing act for PMRA because on the one hand, they want to make sure that, in our case, farmers have access to good technology. On the other hand, they have to balance the needs or the desires of in the environment, human health as well. So you don't always get what you want when you register a product. There's typically some regulations that you have to abide by. Registering is a science-based evaluation. So anybody submitting a new label or a new active has to submit a number of years of data before PMRA will actually register, and they do evaluate that data, take a look at it. They have their scientists internally that look at it as well. Once you've got a product on the market, there's a 15-year cycle where products will be reviewed and they'll decide, are there changes required to the label? So for example, right now, propiconazole is in the middle of a regulatory review. We're involved in that. So it means going through the label and looking at what is acceptable today, what has been used in the past, and what changes are required from an environment, health, scientific standard. The other agency that's involved is Health Canada. So if PMRA is the legal system, the lawyers that create the laws, Health Canada is involved in verification and compliance. So think of it like the restaurant or a health business. You can open a restaurant, but Health Canada, somebody is going to come look at your restaurant, make sure that it's clean, you don't have a pest issue of any type. So Health Canada is compliance. Health Canada will typically do an audit of most companies on a random basis. Again, not unlike the restaurant business. They don't tell you, hey, next year you're going to get audited. It's really a random process where they will notify a company and say, we're going to be at your location in the next 3 to 4 weeks. We want to look at this. We want to see this label. We want to look at your manufacturing facility. We're going to set a time, but please provide us with this information before we show up. That's a normal process. Every company goes through this. So specifically tank mixes in Canada, one thing I always remind everybody that I deal with internally is the label is always the law. If there's any doubt about what can and cannot happen with a product, you always refer back to the label. Specifically referring to tank mixes, historically, only registered tank mixes as indicated on the label could be used. So it didn't matter what the product was. If you didn't have a tank mix between product X and product Y on your label, in theory, you could not mix it, even if you knew that it worked, even if you knew there was no risk to the user or to the crop or to non-target pests or weeds, you still could not use it. In fact, using an unregistered tank mix would be considered a criminal offense if it was not on the label. Oh, you can imagine what kind of turmoil that makes when you start seeing the number of products go up. For example, in the cereal broadleaf category, you have well over 100 different cereal broadleaf mixes. So it's simply impossible for a company to add that many products to the label, given that there's always new products coming. So in 2012, PMRA made an amendment to the law simply due to the number of products on the market and the challenge that farmers, retailers in the industry face in trying to figure out how do you provide good, up-to-date information to the business given the flood of products in the marketplace. So the outcome of that was in about 2012, PMRA changed the positioning saying unlabeled tank mixes would be permitted provided both products were registered and applied within their registered use pattern, i.e., again, according to what's on the label. So that meant farmers could apply unlabeled tank mixes subject to the following conditions. And that was both products had to be registered. You still have to follow the most restrictive label guidelines and precautions on both labels. If you required an adjuvant on one of the labels, you still had to do it. The timing of all tank mix partners was compatible as related to the crop and the pest. Each tank mix partner had to be applied according to the restrictions, the directions, the buffer zones, resistant management. Again, back to the label. Something that was interesting is you also had to make sure the tank mix was not specifically excluded or contraindicated on either tank mix label. What that means, if product X said you can tank mix, but product X or Y said you cannot tank mix with anything other than what's on the label, you could not tank mix it with anything not on the label. And the final one was really boilerplate. The tank mix had to provide additional value to the user. For example, you'd get more weeds or pest control, contributes to resistant management, cost or time saving. So it was a way for PMR to say, look, we know that farmers are tank mixing. We know that farmers are using tank mixes that are not on the label. We know that quite often retailers and companies are recommending them because they're trying to help farmers make the best decision for that field or that farm. So they cannot possibly follow the law as it exists. So they made some exceptions, which I think was good for the industry. As a consequence of this, most companies came out with their supported tank mix list. So for example, if you went to the Syngenta website a few years ago, they would provide a list of the products that you could use with their products, and they would support. In other words, if you did it, they'd say, we agree. We don't have any concerns about you doing this.
Can I ask a question
Sure.
about that? So we have, like in your guys' well put together guide, you also have approved tank mixes with some products.
Yes.
Does that mean it excludes other compatible actives from other companies then? As it specifies certain ones that are supported? There's a difference between being supported versus being allowed, correct?
Yes. So it means that you can mix with others, but we want you to understand that if you're not sure, call us. It's not possible for us to put every tank mix in our guide, so we've chosen to do ones that either are Viking or we believe are going to be the highest use. So for example, clodinafop or pinoxidin 50, we've added some in there that we believe are probably going to be the most frequent ones asked. And we'll continue to do that, but no, if it's not there, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't support it, but we would like you to call and check just to make sure.
Mm-hmm.
Or talk to the other company and say, okay, I'm thinking of doing this. They're probably going to say no, but an example is Stavanger. If you're thinking of using Stavanger, it's the same actives as Prestige. If you can use Prestige, you can use Stavanger. No issue.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's the key message to get across for folks was, in my mind, this is really an exclusionary thing versus an inclusionary one. You really have to look for what is not appropriate. because that is a smaller skew to understand versus what is really acceptable based on how she's looking. So I think and I don't think there was really that clarity before in some ways, other than, I've used it before and it worked, and most guys don't really dig into the details so much.
Yeah, and internally what we do is we think of actives versus products. So we know the actives, as an example, in Prestige are fluoroxypure, MCPA, and clopyrrolid. If that one's never been an issue and farmers have used it, you're comfortable with it, we have no concerns if you go with Stavanger without calling us.
Yeah, thank you for that.
It's also a great lead into what's changing for 2024. And July 2020, without warning, PMRA published a new streamlined Category B submissions and tank mix labeling. Category B is a process that PMRA uses for basically changing a registration. It's a faster process normally. So Category C is typically a year. Category B is much faster, but they brought out a new document to clarify and consolidate guidance related to tank mixing. The old process still had some confusion around it in terms of what is the responsibility of a company, and is it going to cause confusion in the marketplace as to what's permitted and what's not permitted. The consequence of that is now it's really going to be up to the companies to decide what guidance they provide to tank mixing, when a tank mix would be permitted and when it's not. So the big change is, in order for a tank mix to be permitted, there must be text on the product label that specifically allows for tank mixing. And I've got a chart a couple of slides down the road that'll clear this up. But one example they used is you can have either mention of the tank mix partners. In this case, product X may be mixed with product Y, or a new general label statement that permits tank mixing. And that is the big change. Companies now have the option of adding a general tank mix label statement around tank mixing, but they're not forced to. So typically in the past, you would have to state on your label, you must mix with this and that's it. Now, this general reference is possible. So specific tank mixes may appear on the label of one or both tank mix partners, but there's no longer a requirement for the tank mix to appear on both products, which allows more flexibility. So here's what it looks like. Companies may now choose to put the general tank mix statement on their product labels, but they're not required to. So I'll let you look at the language itself. But essentially, the onus is now on the companies to decide what they want to do with their products in regards to tank mixing. There is still a caveat that tank mixing pest control products can result in reduced control or injury. The user, in this case the farmer, should contact the company at this number for information before applying any tank mix not specifically recommended on this label. So again, they're really putting the onus on the company to decide, how do you want to manage tank mixes for your products? So this is what the new regulations look like in terms of specifics. Product X would be the first product, let's say a graminicide, and cereals. Product Y might be a cereal broadleaf product. So if the labels have no reference to tank mixing at all, nothing, on both the first product and the second product, no tank mixing is permitted. If the first product, graminicide, says yes, you can tank mix, but the second one says nothing, there's no reference to tank mixing at all, the answer would be no. Likewise, if the first product has no reference to tank mixing, but the second one has a general tank mix statement, the answer is no. What I've seen so far in the marketplace is most of the major companies are going with the next 3 or 4 lines. They are adding the general tank mix statement to their product labels, which means that they can be tank mixed. But if in doubt, a farmer owns the liability, and they should phone before they do anything just to make sure there's no risk to the crop or to the pests or to themselves. So I sent Riley this presentation tomorrow or yesterday. He can forward that to you. It is a bit legalese, but this is in there. It does a good job of explaining what the new guidelines are. But I've been looking at Syngenta, BASF, Bayer, Corteva in the last few days. And to date, most of their products have the new general tank mix statement on them. There are a few exceptions. And as of today, I don't know if that's deliberate or whether it's simply the fact that PMRA has been flooded with label changes by everybody to include this tank mix statement, and they may well be behind in their workload.
Yeah, that's a question I had for you, Brian, because it defines products versus ingredients.
Yes.
And so as a farmer, if a company has not quite got there yet, is there a way of understanding what they can and can't do based on a precedent label that has, it's been common practice for that to work? Like how would most guys, what guidance would be given to them on the best way to approach that?
They'll have to contact the individual company and ask, okay, I've always used this product. Now with these new tank mix guidelines, my retail looked at the label and the general tank mix statement is not there yet. Is it coming? Or are you saying no tank mixing unless we say so? It's going to come back to the individual company. But again, having said that, everywhere I've looked so far, most of the major companies, I haven't looked at a New Farm or an Adama yet, but everybody's been adding the tank mix statement. So there's been a lot of label updates this year, lots.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. Because, I was dealing with some stuff with Sharda, for example, and they were just hurrying up to get that stuff submitted. And they're in queue, but I don't know if it's on the store yet, or they're on their website yet, rather, for updated and that. So I think, like you said, it's best to double check.
Well, and we've talked to PMRA a couple of times this week on this, because we have some products that are in the queue and waiting as well. Mm-hmm. And the guidance we were given is we're working on it as per our general work plan. We'll get to it when we get to it. My expectation is, given that it's a federal government agency, the deadline is late December. On December 24th or 23rd, there's going to be a flood of registrations coming back to companies.
That's good. That's adequate. Good. Thank you for that.
So what is Viking doing? All of our Viking product labels will have the general tank mix stated added. The website will be updated to reflect these changes. The new 2025 product guide will be updated to add these changes. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, we are in ongoing discussions with PMRA regarding the timing of the label approvals and implementation of the new policy. They have not admitted they're behind, but we know they are because we have deadlines with them. But again, my expectation is by the end of the year, there's going to be an absolute flood of label changes coming through with the new tank mix statement added. Any questions about that?
That was very informative. Ryan, do you have, I'll give you the floor for a sec if you happen to have any questions about stuff, anything that you needed clarity on at all? Might be.
No, not really. I'm just trying to, there's a lot of information in 15 minutes, so I'm trying to process it.
That's an honest answer. I'll be sending this.
And I'm in the house with my kids getting ready to leave for school, so I'll admit my focus wasn't 100%.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah, I think the key will be is I think there was a lot of trepidation that a lot of things that used to be allowed were no longer going to be allowed. People didn't know what the regs were going to look like based on some of the agronomists that I had spoken with. But this, in my mind, it really provides, it's actually clarity on it. And then I'm curious about if you have a feeling for, you have Class C and Class B registration types. What does that do for speeding up the timeline of getting things registered?
Typically, Category B is much faster. So Category B used to be 45 days. Now, this document was released in March 2023. There's been some updates to it that have not been made really public, but they moved a lot of these to Category C. And we don't know the reason for that, but Category C is typically 9 months. It's also significantly more expensive. Category B used to be a few $100s. Category C is way more money. And it allowed PMRA more time. I think when they did this initially, they said, yeah, we can do this. But when the process started and companies started to submit labels like Viking did, they went, holy crap, we're going to be flooded. We're going to make this Category C to allow more time for us to get through all these labels.
Yeah, so that bought them time, which is, I get that. There's only so many hours a day and so many bodies or whatever. What does that do to the corporation other than losing time of being able to share about it? Is there an actual monetary hit as well if they do dump it into the sea, or is it just it gives them a broader window to get their act together and get her through quicker?
It's a huge financial hit because now you go from a couple $100s to about $1,300 per label.
Really? Just because of, okay. So we need a temp agency to help those guys out to hammer through stuff, eh?
Well, and to make matters worse, our discussions with PMRA, it's our belief that they're short-staffed right now.
Sure.
These positions are not easy to fill. They require a very high level of detail, sharp eyes to make sure that all the fine details are being looked at. Also, labels are an ongoing process. So, for example, PMRA is always updating the precautions, the environmental restrictions. Those are updated on an ongoing basis as more information comes in and as labels are reevaluated. So in some cases, companies are not only submitting tank mix changes, but they're also submitting precautions, hazards, provincial/territorial, resistant management. So there's other changes that have to be looked at the same time. And PMRA said, that's what we want you to do. So you only do it once. So the consequence of that is the workload has also gone up at the same time.
Yeah, so all the way around. Yeah.
It's tough to be sympathetic to government sometimes because they don't always get it right. But in this case, the workload will be overwhelming.
Yes. Now, In terms of the differentiation of a US situation versus Canada, even percentage of effort involved or hoops to jump through, is their system simpler or more onerous than Canada's?
It's actually very similar because with NAFTA, they coordinated regulatory. So a lot of the things that we do here are very similar to the US. There are situations where they'll get a registration quicker because of the market size, and companies will choose to kind of push it through the US faster, but a lot of it is coordinated these days.
So for example, if I have a US product that's registered as a multinational company, would I be able to, assume is the wrong word with using government, but would it be appropriate to submit that approved US product under a category B in Canada to get it, quote, fast tracked? Or is there a lot more steps or issues?
No, actually, it's very similar process. So if you're going to submit for the US, you probably submit for Canada at the same time. So they're not 100% the same, but a lot of the processes would be parallel to each other. The difference really is going to be the priority the company puts on it. So for example, if you've got a new soybean herbicide coming, they're few and far between, but if you've got something new for soybeans as a tank mix or a new herbicide tolerant trait, you'll typically submit both, but you'll probably put a little bit more pressure and time and money into the US because of the market size.
And then if you do have it registered in the US but have yet to put it into Canada, that is where that category B option may be applicable. Would that be correct?
Yeah, final registrations are category B. If you want to make amendments to a label, let's say you want to add some tank mixes or something along those lines, then it moves to category C. But category, I'm trying to simplify it, but it's actually more complicated than that. If it's a brand new product, it has kind of its own system that you push it through. It's based on the science, the data you submit, the number of years of trials. That's what drives the process versus the category B and C, which are really label amendments or changes.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard stories of, not just hundreds of thousands, but millions going into the initial registration of some products, and you have to backcast all the trialing and effort that's went into stuff for half a dozen years or longer to bring it to it. So that's, I'm assuming, a little more onerous process.
Yeah, from the time you discover it, basic discovery, until you register, typically it's 7 or 8 years. And then with patent protection, you might have 10 years to actually try and make your money back if you're one of the majors. But you can change that a little bit by providing as much data as possible up front. There's a list of things you'll be required to add. For example, human health exposure, rat studies, all the stuff you see on the label. If you do a really, really good job up front of providing that, it will be faster. If you do your initial submission and there's pieces missing, then the regulatory agencies will come back and say, we can't do this. You need to provide this data before we can proceed.
Thank you.
Go
ahead.
In terms of cost, the assumption right now is if you want to register a new active, you're going to think globally. You're going to look at, does it fit in North America? Does it fit in Europe, South America, Asia Pacific? And you'll look at the market potential, because by the time you include all the regulatory and research costs across the world, you're probably talking hundreds of millions of dollars, $200, $300, $400 million. So you're going to think very carefully about, does it make sense to launch this active? Can we make a return on our investment here?
Relating to revenue recapture or investment recapture, are you comfortable commenting on both data comp, on how other companies are able to access molecules quicker that are already, they may still or may not have a patent thing to it, but also there's the manufacturing component on how they arrive at that, which is almost a separate issue, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have a comment on that?
Sure. So when a product comes off patent, companies are able to access it, and they're able to start the discussion about data comp. What data comp is really payment for the number of studies that went into the original registration. So as an example, if you want to register a new MCPA formulation, as long as it's similar to the ones on the market, chances are the data comp is not going to be that much because it's been around for a while. There's not many outstanding studies. If it's a newer product that has a number of crops, restrictions, spring, fall application, a long list of weeds controlled, your data comp will be more because the number of studies is longer. If you want that product, then it comes back to, do you want to pay for every single weed, or do you just want core weeds? If you want core weeds that were in the initial registration, it'll be X. If there were weeds added further on after it was registered, that may be additional cost because there's additional studies involved. So if you're a company, what you want to do is start with an initial registration and then add on weeds, tank mixes, crops later on, because that will buy you not so much time to keep it off patent, but it means the data comp for another company will be higher when it comes off patent because they'll have to help pay for those studies. It's a way to compensate the original registration holder for the work that they did.
On that note, is that a negotiated number? Is there any oversight on what is reasonable to charge to get things, or do they look at precedences on things, or do you have a feel on that?
Sure. So PMRA becomes the referee on this. So they'll kind of help determine what is the cost for this study, what is the cost for that study. So they act as almost a go-between between the original label holder and the company that wants to put that label in the marketplace. There is a level of negotiation involved, but it's more a question of, okay, there's all these studies. Are there any that maybe aren't as important that we can live without? For example, maybe it's a product you're considering for post crops, but it also has blueberries, caneberries, raspberries on there. That would be an additional study and additional cost. So you might say, you know what? We're not in the horticulture market. We're not going to pay for studies on caneberries, blueberries, and raspberries. So that we'll take that off the label.
Now, to daisy chain onto that, then, as we look at the new labeling requirements or the new catchphrase that can go in there, does that preclude a company from needing to do all the data comp if there's precedence with the other labels that are just more refreshed than the older label verbiage? How does that reconcile?
Unfortunately, the data comp is a separate thing from the tank mixes. So most companies will put the tank mix on, but they'll still have to pay for the data comp.
Interesting. Okay. So there's the ingredient component of that, and then there's the manufacturing process that may be unique as well. Is that a separate category to that? Or, like, for example, we have pinoxidin coming into the marketplace, some with and most without built-in surfactant. I assume that there would be different data comps attributed between the two, and as well, there's different processes to arrive at product A versus product B. Is there a differentiation in is it data comp, or is there actually a process registration on how they arrive at the formulation?
That's actually a process. The data comp typically only applies to the scientific studies to the registration. So anything in the manufacturing background is different. What you don't see on a label is there's a requirement to advise PMRA where it's manufactured, who the manufacturer is. So it is a slightly different thing there versus data comp. But to
Thank
your
you.
earlier point, Dean, about, different companies do different things. It really depends on two things. First of all, is the product off patent? Secondly, the data comp, whether it be Sharda, whether it be Viking, whether it be another generic company, they're all bound by the same process. And the data comp is going to be the same for each company. It's really up to the company to decide how important is it to get blueberries, raspberries, and caneberries on the label, and how much are you prepared to pay to add that?
Mm-hmm. Understood. Okay. Last one. Thank you for all your indulging me. What about, we have different concentrations or iterations. We've got liquid versus dry. We've got chloralzalam 25%, 50%, and stuff like that. Would those be considered completely different chemistries and have to go through their own processes, or what would be involved with that type of stuff?
Yeah, anytime you change a formulation, you have to do a new registration for it. So in the case of flurazolam, the original registration would have been on this formulation. If you're coming out with a new formulation, PMRA would consider that a new product. So you'd have to do a separate registration. The process will probably be faster because it's a change in formulation versus a change in the active, but it still requires a different registration. So as example, Axial or Pinoxidin, if you go to PMRA and look, you'll find there's actually multiple registrations because of the different formulations.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you for, I'm just a dummy with a lot of that stuff, so I appreciate you being patient and laying it out nice and clearly for me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is any other input before I quit recording from anybody? Okay, I'll just stop that then.